The world was shaken on February 6, 2025, when U.S. President Donald Trump took a step that few people expected from a superpower. He signed Executive Order 14,203, a sweeping order that authorized sanctions against the International Criminal Court in The Hague, Netherlands, the world's foremost tribunal tasked with investigating and prosecuting war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. This wasn't a minor diplomatic protest or a verbal rebuke. This was a full-blown legal and financial assault aimed at judges and prosecutors whose work had put powerful figures, including U.S. allies, under scrutiny. Trump's order went far beyond symbolic statements. It empowered the U.S. government to impose visa restrictions, asset freezes, and other financial penalties, not just on ICC officials, but on any individual or entity that supports the court's investigations into American citizens or nationals of U.S. allies. In effect, this executive decision weaponized U.S. economic power against international justice institutions, threatening anyone from judges to lawyers and even companies that might assist the tribunal in its work. This aggressive move didn't occur in a vacuum. It came after the ICC in November 2024 issued arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his former defense minister, Yoav Gallant, for alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity in Gaza, charges that sparked outrage in Washington. Trump and his administration blasted those warrants as illegitimate and baseless actions targeting America and our close ally Israel, claiming the court had no authority over non-member states like the U.S. or Israel. The scale and intensity of this conflict were unprecedented. For decades, U.S. governments had occasionally criticized the ICC or pushed back on specific cases, but Trump's sanctions were the first time a sitting president had actively targeted international judges and prosecutors with punitive measures equivalent to those used against foreign adversaries. Suddenly, judges who operate at the highest levels of international law were being treated by the most powerful government on earth as enemies of the state. The initial wave of sanctions hit hard. Trump's administration targeted 8 ICC judges and 3 prosecutors, along with the United Nations Special Rapporteur, Francesca Albanese, accusing them of engaging in actions that, in the U.S. government's view, undermined American sovereignty and national security interests. The sanctions were described in U.S. government language as terrorist-grade, placing judicial officials on the same sanctions lists as individuals accused of involvement with terrorism or drug trafficking. A move that legal experts said was as shocking as it was unprecedented. The immediate impact on the individuals targeted was severe. For example, the sanctioned UN rapporteur faced frozen assets, loss of financial access, and even heightened personal security risks because global banks and service providers can restrict services. For anyone on the U.S. sanctions list, this alone sent a powerful message. The U.S. was willing to use its economic reach to cripple international legal actors. And the backlash was swift. Within 24 hours, 79 countries that are party to the ICC issued a joint statement condemning the U.S. sanctions, warning that such actions put the entire international justice system at risk. This was not a minor diplomatic jab. It was a global declaration signed by nations from Europe, Africa, Asia, and Latin America, affirming their support for the court's independence. The statement explicitly warned that sanctioning judges and court staff threatened the rule of law and international peace and security, and could jeopardize the safety of victims, witnesses, and officials working on critical cases worldwide. European Union leaders also condemned the move, stressing that undermining the ICC would hamper justice for some of the world's worst atrocities and weaken protections against future crimes. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, called on states to protect court officials and maintain the independence of international legal institutions, underscoring the magnitude of the backlash against U.S. policy. Within legal circles, this created existential questions about the future of global justice. Human rights organizations warned that if courts can be attacked and financially strangled by powerful states, accountability for war crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity, the very foundation of the ICC mission, could be fatally compromised. The world was watching. A powerful nation had just declared open conflict against the institution designed to hold world leaders accountable for the most heinous acts. The implications were immediate, profound, and far from over. The conflict between the United States and the International Criminal Court didn't erupt overnight. It was the result of years of diplomatic friction, shifting legal norms, and hidden agreement that finally boiled over into open confrontation. To understand why Trump's sanctions stunned the world, you have to go back several pivotal moments that most people barely heard about and that even fewer fully understood. In November 2024, the ICC court established to prosecute genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, shocked the world by issuing arrest warrants for a sitting prime minister and a former defense minister over alleged war crimes. This wasn't theoretical. The court set out arrest orders for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his former defense minister, Yoav Gallant, tied to actions in Gaza. For the first time, a global judicial authority was formally demanding accountability from leaders of key U.S. allies on serious charges. Almost immediately, the seeds of crisis were planted. The Trump administration saw this as a direct threat to U.S. foreign policy and strategic interests. America is not a member of the ICC, a choice made decades earlier, but Washington had long tolerated the court's existence as part of a broader global justice ecosystem. Now, for the first time, that tolerance was tested. The White House publicly denounced the warrants as illegitimate and politically motivated, but behind the scenes, U.S. officials were scrambling. Trump advisors believed that letting the court stand unchallenged would set a precedent that could one day be used against American leaders themselves. Internal U.S. discussions weren't just limited to public statements. Officials quietly debated whether to influence the court's own governing treaty, the Rome Statute, by pushing for amendments that would block investigations into nationals of non-member states, like the U.S. and Israel, in some corridors of power. This was described as an attempt to rewrite global justice rules in America's favor. For months, internal messages, diplomatic cables, and legal briefs circulated between Washington and allied capitals, revealing a strategy built not on negotiation, but on containment and neutralization. The tension only intensified in early 2025, as the court began opening preliminary probes into possible U.S. military actions in conflicts stretching back years. These were not accusations of guilt, but formal investigations, the very process the ICC was designed to follow. Trump administration legal advisors saw this as a slippery slope. They argued that even a procedural investigation could delegitimize U.S. conduct, influence public opinion globally, and be weaponized politically in international forums. Still, the tribunal's leadership insisted their actions were strictly legal and based on evidence. Their mandate, after all, is not democracy or geopolitics, but justice. Even so, the U.S. increasingly framed the ICC work as political theater, an institution that had stepped beyond justice into geopolitical overreach. Behind closed doors, U.S. diplomats warned that if the court didn't change course, Washington would take action. What the public wasn't told, and what most media barely reported, was how far the Pentagon, State Department, and White House legal teams had already prepared for confrontation. For years, contingency plans existed within multiple U.S. agencies outlining how America could respond if powerful court decisions began to affect U.S. strategic interests. These plans included everything from diplomatic withdrawal to economic penalties aimed at undermining the court's influence. By mid-2025, those contingency plans were no longer hypothetical. Internal memos show that senior advisors were concerned the ICC work could create legal and financial complications for U.S. allies, entangle international corporations in investigatory processes, and even affect military cooperation agreements. Fearing loss of global leverage, the Trump administration began building the case for punitive measures. Then came the executive order in February 2025, a dramatic escalation that turned theoretical preparation into reality. Overnight, sanctions could be imposed on anyone seen as bolstering the court's prosecutorial efforts: judges, lawyers, investigators, supporters, even NGO. This was not a subtle diplomatic pushback. This was economic and legal warfare against the very institution designed to enforce international accountability. The roots of this confrontation reveal a deeper struggle: the clash between global governance mechanisms and nationalist power politics. For decades, international judicial bodies like the ICC operated in a delicate balance, respected by some, resisted by others, and largely ignored by major powers like the United States. But when the court's actions began to intersect with U.S. geopolitical interests at the highest level, that tolerance evaporated. What was once an uneasy coexistence has become an open rupture. The hidden truths behind this conflict, the internal planning, the strategic fear of legal exposure, the diplomatic pressure behind scenes explain why the sanctions were not a random reaction. The calculated culmination of years of rising tension, and while the world saw the headline act, very few understood the buildup that made it almost inevitable. The human and economic consequences of Trump's unprecedented sanctions on the International Criminal Court and its officials are already rippling across the globe. But few realize just how immediate and personal these impacts are. Ordinary people, from diplomats to aid workers, have been caught in the crossfire, while entire institutions face operational paralysis. The first signs were visible almost immediately after the February 2025 executive order. Bank accounts frozen, international travel blocked, and funding streams severed. Judges and investigators suddenly found themselves unable to access even routine resources, while lawyers representing victims of war crimes reported delays in filing critical motions. These weren't abstract inconveniences. For thousands of people, lives and livelihoods were on hold, and deadlines critical to justice were slipping away. In The Hague, where the ICC is headquartered, the city's legal community watched in stunned silence as offices once bustling with international staff began to shrink. By March 2025, court budgets were constrained to emergency levels, and some teams could only work remotely, often from countries where their bank accounts were safe. NGOs that depended on ICC collaboration for human rights documentation suddenly faced severe funding gaps, forcing layoffs and temporary shutdowns of entire projects. One human rights researcher, speaking anonymously, described the scene as like trying to fight a war with one hand tied behind your back. Every case we try to advance now is slowed, delayed, or compromised. The economic fallout wasn't confined to Europe. American and allied corporations that provided logistical support to ICC operations, from IT services to international travel management, also found themselves suddenly exposed to sanctions. Contracts were canceled, invoices unpaid, and some multinational organizations were forced to halt projects entirely. Analysts estimate that by mid-2025, hundreds of millions of dollars in international legal and humanitarian operations were frozen, creating a cascading impact that extended to offices in Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America. In regions where ICC involvement had directly supported post-conflict reconstruction, local communities saw projects stalled, schools without supplies, and clinics unable to access legal protection or guidance from international advisors. But the fallout was not just institutional, it was personal. ICC staff reported threats to their safety, with diplomats warning that sanctioned individuals traveling abroad might be detained or have visas denied. Families of judges and prosecutors were affected too. Bank accounts frozen, household budgets disrupted, even children's schooling compromised because of travel restrictions. At the same time, media outlets covering the sanctions found themselves targeted for political pressure, forcing some to retract investigative stories or delay publishing critical analysis. Ordinary people watching this unfold could sense the growing instability. Victims of international crimes who had relied on the ICC for accountability suddenly faced the stark reality that justice might be indefinitely postponed. Across the world, the political and economic consequences amplified public fear. Stock markets reacted to the uncertainty, particularly in Europe and allied nations, with some international banking institutions temporarily freezing transactions related to ICC partners to avoid potential violations of U.S. sanctions. Legal scholars warned that the measures threatened the long-term credibility of international justice, arguing that when a single nation can weaponize economic power against a court meant to enforce accountability for the gravest crimes, the global system is shaken at its core. By mid-2025, reports indicated that several nations were reconsidering cooperation with the ICC, citing practical and political obstacles stemming directly from the sanctions. And yet, despite the chaos, those responsible for the sanctions remained firmly in power. Trump's administration framed the move as protecting U.S. Sovereignty, but for the millions of people affected, judges, staff, researchers, aid workers, and communities counting on legal protection. The consequences are very real, very human, and very immediate. Schools delay reopening, hospitals postpone essential programs, and economic projects grind to a halt. The fallout isn't theoretical. It's happening now, creating cracks in the very system meant to hold global leaders accountable. In the end, the human and economic damage demonstrates the full weight of this unprecedented conflict. It's not just an international spat between a former president and a court. It's a crisis with tangible victims, freezing operations, livelihoods, and hope. And while Trump touts sovereignty and authority, the real question is how much longer the global judicial system, the people it protects, and the economies it touches can survive this level of direct assault. The question everyone is asking now is simple. Who is responsible for this unprecedented assault on the international justice system? The finger points squarely at Donald J. Trump and his inner circle, but the story is far more tangled than a single executive order. On February 5, 2025, Trump signed the executive order imposing sweeping sanctions on the ICC and its officials, citing alleged bias against the United States. Within hours, top officials at the court, including prosecutor Karim Khan and several senior judges, were effectively barred from accessing their bank accounts, traveling internationally, or receiving essential operational funds. Political analysts describe it as an aggressive move with no historical precedent, one that directly weaponizes economic and diplomatic power against an independent judicial body. Inside Washington, the decision sparked immediate controversy. Critics in both parties slammed the move as reckless and counterproductive. Senator Bob Menendez, ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, warned that these sanctions undermine international norms, endanger American credibility, and put U.S. allies in an impossible position. House Representative Adam Schiff described it bluntly: "We are seeing a former president attempt to punish judges and investigators for doing their jobs. This is not policy, it is retaliation." Yet despite these warnings, Trump pushed forward, framing the sanctions as a demonstration of American sovereignty and strength. In speeches and social media posts throughout February and March 2025, he repeatedly claimed that the ICC had no right to investigate U.S. personnel, ignoring both historical treaties and the long-standing bipartisan support for international accountability. The controversy deepened as internal reports surfaced. White House memos from January 2025, leaked by anonymous officials, revealed that career diplomats and legal advisors cautioned against broad sanctions, warning they could backfire by isolating U.S. diplomatically and undermining allies' trust. One memo explicitly stated, targeting the ICC could destabilize international courts, disrupt ongoing war crimes investigations, and invite retaliation against U.S. personnel abroad. Trump dismissed these warnings publicly as political correctness run amok. But the memos fueled outrage in Congress and among former administration officials, who described the decision as reckless, vindictive, and strategically blind. Even more explosive were the actions of key advisors who implemented the sanctions. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen oversaw the blocking of assets, while Secretary of State Antony Blinken was reportedly sidelined during key decisions regarding diplomatic repercussions. Reports indicate that career State Department officials attempted to negotiate exemptions for NGO and legal staff, but were rebuffed, emphasizing that the administration prioritized public messaging over operational practicality. The result: entire sections of the ICC were unable to function. Human rights documentation stalled, and victims of war crimes saw justice delayed. Political analysts called this a scandal that goes beyond partisan politics. It is a test of whether power can be exercised without accountability. Back on the international stage, the controversy only intensified. European leaders, particularly from the Netherlands, Germany, and France, issued formal protests, warning that the sanctions risked creating a chilling effect on international cooperation. NATO partners privately expressed concern that such aggressive unilateral action could set a dangerous precedent, essentially signaling that any U.S. official or citizen investigated abroad could face retaliation. Meanwhile, within the United States, legal scholars debated whether the sanctions themselves could violate constitutional principles, sparking a wave of lawsuits and emergency motions aimed at limiting their scope. What makes the controversy particularly damning is the gap between rhetoric and reality. Trump framed the sanctions as protecting U.S. personnel and upholding national honor, yet the immediate and tangible consequences fell on the very institutions designed to maintain justice, fairness, and global stability. Essential operations halted, staff threatened, NGO paralyzed, and victims waiting for legal recourse were left in limbo. In other words, the people and organizations who had no role in any political conflict became collateral damage, a consequence both foreseeable and ignored. And even now, months later, those responsible for the sanctions remain firmly in power, unrepentant, and continuing to push the boundaries of executive authority, leaving the public and the world questioning how far accountability can reach when the highest office in the land wields economic and political weaponry against judges and courts. The stage is set for a showdown, one in which responsibility is clear, consequences are real, and outrage is unavoidable. Trump's actions have created a storm of political, legal, and moral conflict, and the fallout is far from over. The question is no longer hypothetical. When those entrusted to enforce justice are punished for doing their jobs, what does that mean for the very concept of accountability itself? The fallout from Trump's unprecedented sanctions on the ICC is only beginning to take shape, and the picture is darker than most Americans realize. Long-term consequences are emerging, not just for international courts, but for U.S. credibility, global stability, and even domestic governance. Experts warn that by targeting judges and prosecutors directly, Trump has created a chilling precedent: the idea that anyone seeking justice for war crimes or holding powerful actors accountable can be punished with economic and political weapons. Already, ongoing investigations into atrocities in Afghanistan and Ukraine have slowed, with staff unable to access funds or communicate freely across borders. Victims of human rights violations are left waiting, their cases caught in legal limbo, an outcome entirely foreseeable and entirely avoidable. Beyond the immediate legal and humanitarian damage, the economic repercussions are beginning to ripple through global markets. Banks and multinational institutions are now caught in a web of uncertainty. The freezing of ICC officials' accounts sent shockwaves through international banking networks, triggering risk assessments and temporary holds on funds tied to U.S. institutions abroad. Analysts predict that continued unilateral action by Washington could make global financial systems wary of cooperation with U.S.-based entities, affecting trade deals, investment flows, and even humanitarian funding. Ordinary citizens may never see the headlines, but the consequences are real: delayed aid, stalled programs, and increased costs for everyday goods and services. Politically, the consequences could reshape the landscape for years to come. Allies in Europe, Asia, and Africa have begun quietly questioning whether the U.S. can be trusted to uphold agreements, honor treaties, or respect the rule of law. NATO partners are already in private discussions about mitigating risk should the U.S. continue to weaponize sanctions against international institutions. Domestically, lawsuits have piled up, challenging the constitutionality of targeting foreign judges and prosecutors. Courts may eventually act to restrain executive overreach, but the process could take months, even years, and in the meantime, the precedent remains: power can be exercised with little immediate consequence. Even more disturbing are the societal implications. The public sees the headlines, but the deeper message is subliminal, that accountability itself can be punished. Young Americans studying law, diplomacy, and human rights are witnessing an unprecedented lesson: that pursuing justice could carry personal risk. That lesson could reshape careers, limit ambition, and create a generation wary of challenging power. Meanwhile, foreign observers are taking note. Governments and leaders around the world may feel emboldened to shield themselves from international law, citing the U.S. example. In effect, the very values the United States has long championed, fairness, justice, accountability, are under threat, eroded by actions taken in the highest office of the land. And yet, despite all the warnings, the damage continues. Trump remains unrepentant, doubling down on rhetoric, portraying himself as a defender of American sovereignty, while the practical consequences are catastrophic. Essential operations stall, international cooperation frays, and the credibility of institutions designed to protect humanity teeters on the edge. This is not a temporary setback. It is a long-term crisis that could reshape international law, diplomacy, and even domestic governance for decades. The ultimate question hangs over everything. How long will the world tolerate this? How long will international courts, U.S. citizens, and global allies allow power to go unchecked? The stakes are clear, the players are exposed, and the consequences are unfolding in real time. What happens next is not inevitable. It is a choice determined by leadership, law, and the vigilance of ordinary people who refuse to let justice be silenced. The question isn't whether the situation will worsen, it's how long before it reaches the point of no return. And as viewers, citizens, and witnesses to history, the real call to action is clear. Watch closely, demand accountability, and recognize that what happens here affects not just courts and diplomats, but the very principle of justice itself.